So for webinar number 2, this is our agenda. We'll start out with a discussion about learning about the clinical trial experience. Dr. Rashmi Chugh of the University of Michigan will first present live, and then we'll have comments and experiences shared by a clinical trial participant, John Fields. Dr. Chugh, turning over to you. You need to unmute.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you for that kind introduction, Jean. And I wanted to just thank the DTRF entire team just for being such great advocates for you, our patients, as well as us physicians and physician investigators. And you know, as she mentioned, we're here to talk about today the clinical trial experience. I'm a physician over at University of Michigan, and I specialize in connective tissue tumors, including desmoid tumors, as well as clinical trials. So kind of the first thing what I'd like to talk about is just what is a clinical trial? So there's lots of different definitions that we have. This is one specifically that comes from the National Institutes of Health. And a clinical trial is essentially a research study in which one or more humans or patients are assigned to some type of treatment or intervention. You know, that could include something like a sugar pill or a placebo. And we really are going to look at how those interventions play out in terms of the effects on your own health and outcomes. So that's what a clinical trial is. Now, clinical trials in desmoid tumors are notoriously hard to conduct. You know, you all know that this is a pretty rare tumor, so sometimes it's hard to get enough patients. And every patient is a little bit unique, whether you're, you know, tumors in the neck or the arm, or it causes pain or blocks your bowel. You know, every situation is different. So when we're thinking about doing the same treatment and looking at the same types of outcomes, it's a difficult thing to design. It's also sometimes difficult to find support for studies. You know, studies are expensive, and in order to conduct them, we need the support of either pharmaceutical companies willing to allow their drug to be used and to give funding for that, or sometimes we can look independently for grants or funding from national institutions or philanthropy. So clinical trials in desmoid tumors have been hard to conduct for years. And for years, we really had to rely on what we call retrospective studies, or kind of looking back at how desmoid tumor patients have done in the past to try to understand, you know, how to best treat patients. These types of studies can be helpful and can teach us something, you know, but unfortunately, they can be biased. And then they can have all different types of outcomes that are different to interpret. So just to kind of help you understand what this means. So, you know, we could, you know, decide to look back at all our patients that were treated with anti-inflammatories. And if you look back at studies that have been published, you can see that, you know, anti-inflammatories can help patients anywhere from 25 to 50% of the time. Anti-hormone treatment can help patients anywhere from 12% of the time to 60%, chemotherapy 12 to 80%. How do we make sense of these numbers when we look back in time? So really kind of the information that we get from retrospective studies often, you know, create a lot more questions. There have been some good studies, some good information, you know, one example of which of a really important retrospective study that was performed that gave us a lot of information about how to treat desmoid patients is some of the wait and see approaches, retrospective studies where you know, groups looked how patients were treated in the past. This particular study was performed in Europe, and they looked at 142 patients with desmoid tumors that were treated without surgery. So for years, as you guys know, we started off with removing the tumors and then learned maybe that's not the best idea. And we looked back and saw, well, you know, of these patients that were treated with a non-surgical approach, you know, over half of them were just monitored. Some of them received medications. After 5 years, half of them that were just observed didn't have growth of the tumor. About 60% that were treated with medications didn't have growth of the tumor. And so this type of study gave us confidence to kind of not do surgery. And that made us, kind of even spend more time looking at what medications can be helpful and not focusing just on surgeries. So those are kind of retrospective studies. Now, let's talk what we've learned from clinical trials and kind of how that has been a useful part of learning about patient care in desmoid tumors. So this is a study many of you might have heard about. This is an example of a clinical trial that I wanted to give as we talk about what's involved. And this was a study that was performed. It's called a phase 3 randomized study where 87 patients were randomly assigned either to receive this pill that is kind of a protein blocker. And again, I'm going to try to simplify this as best as possible to kind of make the point that what we learned from this study is when we gave 49 patients this study medication and 35 patients placebo, we were able to really objectively say that the tumor shrank about a third of the time when we received in patients that received that protein blocker. And there was no growth in 2 years and about 80%. And when you compared that, you saw that these patients that were treated with this did better than if they received a sugar pill. But we also learned that objectively, about 20% of the time, the tumor shrank even on a sugar pill. So studies like this provide invaluable information to us as physicians to treat you, to know, to let you know what to expect, and to also, give us even more confidence. And sometimes, no treatment is okay. Another study that was very important in kind of, teaching us is one where similarly was looking at 2 different types of treatment. This is called the Desmoid study. It was conducted in Europe. And that looked at 72 patients that had progressive desmoid tumor. 48 received this protein blocker medication called pazopanib, and 20 received kind of a more standard IV chemotherapy that we used for years. And that, even though this study wasn't designed as a direct comparison, it gave us a better idea of how often we saw tumor shrinkage with one drug versus another. And this is a lot more information that we can gather from retrospective studies. So now, what's involved in these studies? Well, first of all, we are so lucky that now there's more clinical trials to choose from than ever. When I first started doing this, it was pretty rare to have a clinical trial in desmoid tumors. Now, all of the clinical trials has to be listed on a website called www.clinicaltrials.gov. And there's 13 studies kind of internationally that are recruiting, and there's 49 that are listed as in some stage of development. Studies can be very specific, just include desmoid tumor patients. And sometimes they're more just inclusive to all different types of tumors and cancers, and desmoids happen to be part of them. Studies can study different things. I'm a medical oncologist, so I've been talking about treatments or interventions or medications that we can use, but there's also studies of prevention or natural history or imaging and scans. So what's involved in these studies? So one of my tasks was to kind of give you guys a little bit of, from a physician perspective, what's involved in a study. And I know this is a super busy slide, but I will tell you, it's a pretty complex process. So the first part of a study is really just finding either an idea or finding support, having a sponsor or drug company interested in conducting a study, or some type of funding in a grant to actually support a study. Once that gets through that process, there's kind of this really large document called a study protocol that's generated that can be anywhere from 50 pages to 300 pages that outlines the details of what the study would do, what the treatment entails, what the follow-up, all of the procedures. And then every institution is a little bit different. At our institution, we have to get, first we have to make sure that the supporter or sponsor, approves the institution to participate. And then the research team has to approve that it's a good fit for our team to do this study here. And once we get through that process, then there's a series of study reviews. There's a official protocol review committee, there's a pharmacy committee, there's an imaging committee, and then of course we get lawyers involved, and there's a contracting and finance. So there's a number of reviews that have to take place. Eventually, a document called an informed consent document, so that we can tell our patients what's involved, is presented. And we have to get ethics approval to make sure that the study conduct and everything meets the requirements for safety and monitoring that our institution puts forth. And then we have to kind of get through, well, the logistics. How do we conduct this study? And then eventually we start the study. So how long does this all take? Well, even just this first part, finding support, can take months to really, it can take to years to kind of get a good study. Then it can take a few months to get through the initial approvals, another 3-4 months to get through some of the study reviews, and another few months to get through the ethics approval. And really, past the part of finding support, it can really take 6 to 12 months to get a study up and going. And this is all while, we know we have patients that we're treating, and that, we're waiting to kind of get these studies engaged so we can give an opportunity to participate. Now, that wasn't the hard part. Now we have to kind of, after the study is open, you got to find the right patient. The patient has to meet certain criteria that we call the eligibility criteria, to ensure that we have kind of a population that we can learn from. A lot of those criteria can be just that they have a desmoid tumor, or that the tumor is growing or a certain size or causing symptoms. Then we have to make sure patients interested in participating. We give an informed consent document so that they can understand what's involved in the study. Once we find the right patient, there's kind of this screening period where we see if a patient meets all of those qualifications for certain and does some certain tests. Eventually, we get to start treatment and do follow-up, but kind of behind the scenes while all this is going on, there's a lot of work that's being done by the study investigator and the research nurse in coordinating all of this. There's a data manager behind the scenes that are communicating with the sponsor or supporter of the studies, as well as the ethics board, trying to communicate what side effects are seeing, what are the outcomes we're seeing. There's an investigational drug pharmacy that's preparing the treatments. And then there's a research unit often that's coordinating all of these required procedures. It's a pretty complex process, clinical trials in general, and in desmoid tumors, it's definitely, a unique process. All in all told, studies are time and resource intensive. So a lot of, money goes into it. Average cost to a center is about $10,000 to $30,000 per patient we treat on a study. Usually we can get support from the sponsor for that. Sometimes we kind of couple it with some philanthropy support or kind of our own resources in order to bring these important studies to patients. So kind of my last piece I wanted to talk about, which is, one of the most important pieces for you as patients, why would you participate? This seems pretty involved, or why would you not participate? So there's always kind of pros and cons, and bottom line is it's a very individual decision what makes sense for you. One reason to participate is really this is a chance to get access to a new treatment. Sometimes that's the only way we can get access to a new treatment if it's not approved, or if insurance doesn't cover it. The downside is you may not always know what treatment you're getting. Sometimes there are these placebo studies that are not active treatment. A lot of times we can't tell you what the effect might be. We can't tell you how often it might work. We can't tell you what all the side effects are. So there's a lot of unknowns in that. Another reason to participate is that you do follow a very regimented treatment, a very regimented protocol. everyone gets kind of a standard dosing, standard evaluations. You get a little extra attention by a research nurse and coordinated. So sometimes that regimented treatment can be a really nice advantage, especially in a disease where maybe there aren't as regimented things to follow. The downside is that you get a very regimented treatment. So you also, participating in a study is a big time commitment. There are times where you have to be, kind of at your center, getting evaluations, getting seen when it's not convenient to you, when you want to go to the football game, when you have to work. But the rules are that you have to be there at a certain time. That comes at an expense, a travel expense sometimes. Sometimes those expenses are covered. Sometimes it's an expense to not being able to work at a certain time. So those are all things that you have to kind of consider as an individual. Another amazing thing about participating in this study is you really do make an incredible contribution to a greater understanding of the disease and whether a drug can work or not, and whether it works in you. You're still contributing, and whether you have side effects or not, those are all incredibly important things. But kind of the downside is that, we've got to follow rules. There's a lot of rules in the protocol that we have to follow about, when we can start and stop a study drug. A lot of rules about, dosing and things. And those rules don't always make sense for the individual. One example of this is, some studies that have placebos say, well, we can switch you over to the real drug or let you know what you're taking if your tumor grows a certain amount. And sometimes that tumor doesn't grow that exact amount, but you still think it's not helping a patient. And we have to wait and see till we kind of follow that rule in terms of when we can take you off study. If your tumor has grown by 19%, we can't. If it's 20%, we can. So, sometimes it doesn't seem right or fair to have to follow these rules exactly, and it can be frustrating. But overall, clinical trials are an incredible way to learn more and contribute to this disease. And I've talked a lot about kind of my experiences and from my perspective. Now I'm going to hand it over to John Fields, who is a desmoid tumor patient. He's also a clinical trial participant, cat lover, and much, much more. And I appreciate the time he's going to spend talking about it from his perspective.
You just had to throw in cat lover. Okay.
I had to.
All right. So I thank you for that, Dr. Chugh. I appreciate it. Kind of want to just go over what my experience has been from start to finish. And I want to preface it by saying that I know that everyone's is very different. And I've had a good experience. I know that that's not necessarily the case for everybody. So basically, I had a surgery back in beginning of 2019, and then a recurrence. So I have a right gluteal desmoid, and then recurrence middle of the year. So about 4 months after surgery, they removed all of it, came back, same size or bigger. And I was looking into my options. This is before I really found a specialist. I was at my local hospital here in San Diego, Sharp, and there's no desmoid specialist there or anything. So I didn't really know what I was doing. And found the Desmoid Facebook group, first of all, which was a huge saver for me in terms of, what direction I wanted to take things. And when I went and saw my doctor here, they were recommending, certain chemotherapy drugs and that sort of thing. And I knew that I wanted to check out all my options first. So I think it's kind of hard to remember exactly how it all started. But in the Facebook group, I was hearing about a couple clinical trials. So I said, you know what, I'm going to start doing some research on that. So in combination with what I was hearing some people say in the Facebook group, and then doing my own just simple, literally Googling clinical trials for desmoid tumors, I found, I think Dr. Chugh referenced it, clinicaltrials.gov. And that's where I found a trial that kind of piqued my interest and I thought I might be a good candidate for. So first thing that I did was I checked to see if there was any locations in San Diego where I live, and there were not. So I was kind of seeing what was closest to me so I could see if I might be able to perhaps commute in the event I was a candidate, and I found that LA had a couple locations. So I pretty much started out by figuring out on the clinicaltrials.gov, it shows you where the locations are. And I reached out to the trial coordinators at a couple different places, and I ended up driving up to LA, meeting at a couple different, one's at UCLA and then some other center, I forget what it was, and finding what was the best, and at that time I didn't know if I was going to qualify, but I was looking for what was the most comfortable and best fit for me because I really didn't know what to do. I was in a lot of pain and all that. So fast forward a little bit, I figured out where I wanted to be, which doctor kind of made me feel most comfortable and really listened. And I was fortunate enough to have something somewhat close by. I think a lot of people that are trying to get into clinical trials, when you look at locations, and if you don't have a location anywhere near you, then in some instances, I'm sure people get driven away from it, or there are cases where once you're in the trial, travel can be paid for. And kind of jumping around here, I've been lucky enough to have the trial that I'm in has a third party that books my hotel when I'm up there and reimburses for gas and food and that sort of thing. I understand that that's not across all trials. But so that was very helpful. And I've talked to a couple people who were even having to take flights to different states, and that was getting covered. So that's always when you're meeting with the doctor up front to see if you're a candidate, I think that's definitely a reasonable question to be asking the doctor and the trial coordinator to try to figure out, okay, what are the logistics here? Sure, I made it to here for the meeting to see if I'm a candidate, but at the very beginning of the trial that I'm in, it was weekly trips there for a month or a month and a half. So that can be very difficult if you don't either live where the trial is or can just drive a couple hours like I was able to. So I think that's a very important point, is just finding the trial that's the location that's going to make you feel the most comfortable and has what you need, and then figuring out the logistics of getting there. Aside from that, it was my first appointment when I went up there. Before I went up, I sent all my previous MRIs, biopsy reports, surgical reports, all that kind of thing, so that they kind of saved my time by looking over it first and then telling me, yes, you should come see us. It looks like this could work. So upon going there, kind of evaluated everything, and turned out I was a candidate. And basically from there, there was I'm trying to remember, there was some waiting period once you actually signed up for the trial. There was a baseline MRI done so that you had something to go off of. And, I should go back and say that the criteria is fairly strict for getting into it. I think the one I'm in was like 20, that showed 20% increase over a 12-month period or something. I think that was pretty easy for me because it was just a recurrence from surgery. So yeah, and on the website, the clinicaltrials.gov, it typically lists like all of the criteria. So that's all stuff, kind of preliminary stuff that you can look at before you dive too far in. But as for the trial experience in general, once I actually started taking the medication, one of the biggest risk, I'd say, is the fact that you have 50% in a double-blind trial. In a phase 3 double-blind trial, we have, at least that I'm in, you have 50% chance of getting a placebo. So that was a big concern for me. I said, should I just go with the sure thing that, I'm going to be on a drug by taking one of the chemos that my doctor down here was discussing with me, or do I want to roll the dice a little bit and see if I get the drug or the placebo? Something that I'd say to somebody who's considering a trial would be, if it is a double-blind trial, one of the previous presenters, one of the previous doctors was mentioning the method that they have of measuring the tumors, and it can be very different from what you're just looking at on an MRI or what your MRI report says. I've seen unfortunately a lot of people that are get very frustrated because the measurements that the study's going off of is very different than you could think. Wow, I had 20. They tell you if you get 20% growth, then you can be unblinded if you're getting the placebo and given the drug. And so I have communicated with people who've had a really difficult time because what they're seeing is 20% growth, but the way the study's measuring it is in a completely different method and a lot more strict. So that's something to keep in mind. It's my experience was that people that are in this trial have not had as easy of a time switching over from having growth on an MRI as they might have thought to begin with. I was kind of told fairly nonchalantly by my trial coordinator that, oh, you have some increase in size, you can be unblinded and move over. So lucky for me, I do believe I'm on the drug due to side effects that I've had and some benefits that I've had from it. But that will be once we get unblinded, which might be any month now. It was supposed to be like about a 2 years worth of double blind. So then we'll know for sure at that point. I'm going to look at my notes here. I had a couple other things.
John, thank you. We're at the end of our time here, but we'd like to add.
I rambled. I'm sorry.
No, a great presentation. We wanted to add 5 minutes for questions. Manish was monitoring the Q&A. Do you want to pass those over?
Sure, John, I think the first question is for you. It sounds like at the beginning you did a lot of research on your own through Facebook and Google. Did you ever talk to your physician about clinical trials, or did your physician bring up clinical trials to you?
So my physician here in San Diego, I was seeing somebody. It wasn't even a sarcoma doctor. It was a very general oncologist, and there was nobody at my hospital here that I was working with that had any idea about any of it. So it was all on me. And honestly, had I even found the Facebook group prior to having surgery, I probably would have never had surgery. So yeah, it was the Facebook group and then my own research, desmoid tumor, clinical trials, and then I found clinicaltrials.gov. Okay.
Great. Rashmi, did you want to comment on that at all as well? I mean, I think it's really important for patients to do their research and do their work. But from a physician's point of view, do you?
I agree. And one of the points I like to make is, there's a ton of amazing oncologists out in the community and in academic centers even. But, this is a pretty rare tumor. And to really get, people that are educated about it, you do need to kind of find a center where they specialize in it. And even if they don't have a study open, they're more likely to kind of refer you there, educate you about what are the options. So that's why we're lucky to have DTRF, because that's something that comes up when you Google. And so you can get kind of, referred to a place that's, comfortable with educating you on these things.
Yep.
And John, maybe I'll come back to you again for the next question. It sounds like the beginning of the trial was pretty time intensive with a lot of trips and visits. At any point, did you consider stopping the trial? Was it?
No, because like I had said, I knew pretty quickly, and I shouldn't say I know, mostly I haven't been unblinded. I knew pretty quickly I was having benefits. So there was just no way I was going to stop, but I could totally see how if somebody's not feeling like they're getting anything out of it, that they might consider that. I just knew my other options. I didn't like my other options. So I thought I'd tough it out, even if I was on the placebo. Okay. But it is time intensive. I work for myself, fortunately. So I didn't have to do the whole asking for time off, which can be very, very difficult and stressful for people. And then I just had a 2-hour drive, so it wasn't too bad. So those two things definitely worked in my favor.
And then Dr. Chugh, do you want to comment on a little bit about the patient's rights in a clinical trial? If they start a clinical trial, can they stop, or do they have to finish it once they start?
Absolutely. And I think that, of utmost importance is the patient. So, sure, we're trying to get information and learn about a drug, but the priority is always with you. So at any time you can withdraw. At any, we're always going to prioritize you if we think that the study is no longer in your best interest. We can take you off the study and do something different.
But Dr. Chugh, if you do withdraw, we've had some patients have the issue if they've not been told whether they were or they were not on the drug. How does that work?
That is a very frustrating thing, and that's happened to there's certain reasons why the sponsors won't kind of allow that to happen, because they still need to try to get their drug approved and kind of complete the study based on the obligations they put forth in their protocol. So you always have the right to withdraw, but there are certain things that you might not be able to get the data from the sponsor, as it pertains to you.
Which could impact their ability to join another trial or have another treatment, correct? Can you explain that?
Yeah, so some studies, so there are some examples of studies where they will say you are excluded from treatment if you've already had this class of drugs. And if you participate in a study and you weren't ever told what class of, whether you received the drug or not, you might not be eligible for this study. And it's something real that happens. I have a patient that I'm pretty sure was on placebo, and we had to withdraw from treatment because we didn't think it was helping him, and we couldn't wait for it to grow 20%. And so now when we're looking at other studies, unfortunately, we're having trouble, enrolling on a study that excludes prior treatment because we can't say for sure he was receiving placebo or not. We're trying to advocate so that we can get that knowledge, but there are some regulations, things that we're limited on, unfortunately.
Okay, Manisha, I was wrong on time. We have actually 5 more minutes if you want to convey some more questions.
Sure. So I think Ravi's been doing a good job of answering questions via text, but maybe I'll post this to Dr. Chugh as well. There was a question about trials specific to your desmoid tumor location. Now, as far as I know, there's not like a trial that's specific for desmoid tumors in the breast, for example. And I think they're pretty much open to desmoid tumors in any locations, but does the location of the desmoid affect your ability to participate in a trial?
No, it doesn't usually. There's a lot of unique features about desmoid tumors in different locations that we've learned about, mostly from retrospective studies, but most prospective studies don't exclude by location. They might exclude based on side effects people are having from their desmoid tumor. For instance, if you have a tumor within the abdomen that makes you not able to tolerate pills well, they part of the criteria might be you should be able to tolerate pills because the medication is a pill. So, but it wouldn't be specific to the location. It's more criteria that would make sense based on, kind of the way the drug would work.
And I think this is a question specific to John, but I'll turn it to him first and then maybe broaden it to Dr. Chugh. John, did you have to have frequent MRIs with gadolinium to monitor treatment in the trial?
So, of course, I'm allergic to gadolinium, classic. So the first MRI I ever had, I had with gadolinium, and I got a few hives. And so they told me to not take, I have to pre-medicate like prednisone and Benadryl before it. My trial doctor said that he doesn't want me to have to pre-medicate. So I've been doing all of my MRIs without gadolinium. And most people are, yes, the answer is every 3 months we get an MRI. And if you're not allergic to gadolinium, you should be getting gadolinium, is what I understand.
Okay. Dr. Chugh, maybe broaden it a little bit just to the idea of imaging in clinical trials. I know you mentioned there was a lot of rules, but it sounds like there may be a little bit of flexibility, at least with gadolinium and MRIs.
Yeah, there certainly is some flexibility. If you have, as long as you can get consistent imaging, sometimes it's CT, sometimes it's MRI. Gadolinium, for those of you who aren't familiar, is kind of a contrast we use with MRI that helps us see the desmoid tumors a little bit more clearly, but it isn't required always. And sometimes we can get a good view without it. So there is some flexibility, but we still do need to get those, images at certain time points. You might ask, well, gosh, every 3-month MRIs, I was getting them done every 6 months before. Is insurance going to approve it? Usually, we can get the sponsor to pay for studies that we don't think is standard for insurance to cover. So for our study, the sponsor covers every other month scan, every other scan. because it's pretty customary to get scans done every 6 months for most patients, or, but that may vary a little bit by center and by study.
Great. And then one last question, I think. So regarding these rules about the tumor growing enough so that you can transfer over to the other arm, growth of the tumor is not always what maybe the patient cares about. Maybe they're more concerned about pain or range of motion. So are there opportunities to design trials that maybe focus more on that versus growth? And maybe that's a forward-thinking question. Maybe that's not an appropriate one for you, Rashmi, but if you had any thoughts on it.
No, that's a fantastic and a very insightful question. I think what matters to us when we take care of patients is kind of what effect that desmoid tumor has on their life, not necessarily if it's bigger, is it smaller, is it causing pain? Is it blocking your bowels? Is it about to block your bowels? Like things like that. But the problem is those are harder to objectively measure than something like size. And so because of that, a lot of, drugs can get approved by these objective measures, by how often it shrinks the tumor, how long it delays progression of the tumor. And it's a much harder thing to kind of, nuance these, issues about symptoms and pain. That's something we're definitely working on. There's some, patient-related outcomes measures that, those of you who are participating on studies know there's extensive kind of questionnaires and things like that you have to fill out. And so hopefully in the future, we'll be able to do a better job at actually, showing and caring about what matters to patients the most.
Great.
Thank you so much.
To summarize very quickly, I think this was a fantastic session. And I think what I learned is that clinical trials can be complicated. They can be very challenging, but there's a lot of benefit to it as well. From John's experience, personal benefit from it, from Rashmi's talk, benefit, just understanding more about the disease and how drugs can help them. But then also the need to really ask a lot of questions and understand the clinical trial before you participate in it, but then also while you're participating in it, keep asking questions. And if it's not for you, you always have the right to stop.
Okay, thank you very much. Really an incredible discussion.